So, first of all, without further ado, Marianne Levy spent 10 years as an actor and voice artist after studying in Cambridge before becoming a full time children's writer. She has published 5 books for children and teens. Marianne's journalism began with book reviews for The Independent on Sunday before expanding into arts coverage. She has written for The Independent, The Guardian, and The FT. Her roundups and reviews lead the newspaper's children's book coverage alongside her features and book reviews. And in 2018, within a handful of days of having her second child, she felt compelled to write the essay 2 Weeks, which was published on Medium. A few months later, she wrote The Mothers. The huge response to these essays has led her to write extensively about motherhood, both on Medium and for the Eye. Don't Forget to Scream, Unspoken Truths About Motherhood was originally published in 2022, but the paperback came out earlier this year. So, first of all, I'm like, really important question, which is why do you think people are so averse to the sort of the idea of hardship when it comes to motherhood?
Oh, that's such an interesting question and a big question to open with. I think for whatever reason, and I think the reasons are quite complex, we as a society have the sense of a mother as a kind of idealized figure, for whatever reason. And mothers, maybe they suffer, maybe they find it hard, but the important thing is never to speak about that, but to kind of internalize it so that you have this kind of outward carapace of smiling, tender, the Virgin Mary, sort of almost biblical,
Yeah.
endless, beatific, perfected womanhood. And
Mm.
and anything to the contrary of that, I think people find very frightening. And
Yeah.
it goes against our notion of what a mother or a woman can and should be. I think people are quite profoundly disturbed by the sense of anything other than absolute selflessness in mothers. And I think I certainly when I became a mother, I had always assumed that, okay, I'm very flawed as a person, and I feel very various. I'm very human as a person, I think now. But I thought, oh well, all of that will kind of fall away when I discover the perfected, endless, boundless love that I have for my children, and the sense of absolute sacrifice, and that I'll do anything for them. And of course, I do love them boundlessly and I would do anything for them, but that doesn't fall away. Who you are absolutely doesn't fall away, and nor should it fall away, because otherwise you'll be raising children with very unrealistic expectations of what it's like to be in the world and have interpersonal relationships. But I found it very disturbing having to sit with this idealized notion of motherhood and then the understanding of who I actually was. And I found holding those two things together and going about my new life as a mother was profoundly difficult and destabilizing for a very long time, and I still do. Is the honest answer. I still haven't reconciled those two things, but I am trying. That's a longer
Yeah,
answer perhaps than
honest.
you were expecting.
No, no,
But
no. I prefer. I really appreciate you being so candid and honest about it, and
oh, thank you.
longer the better, honestly, because yeah, it is. It is something that so many people experience, but there's just so much hush hush about like how difficult it is. And I remember you talk about algophobia, which I hadn't heard before, which is like the fear of pain. And
Yeah.
so, why do you think people aren't open about sort of the fear of pregnancy? Because like I'm honestly petrified. I've got like multiple health conditions,
Mm.
so it's going to be a really long and arduous and difficult process for me. But honestly, I'm scared. Like, I'm scared of the pain. So why doesn't anyone discuss it?
And it's interesting because I think I was scared of the pain, which feels a pretty natural thing to be scared of pain. And I think, and I do understand why this is so. There's the sense that pain, certainly in the context of having a baby, is different from, say, the pain of breaking your leg. It is a sort of necessary part of birthing a child. But I don't think that makes it any less frightening. But because it's so necessary, there is an understandable assertion from, from both the medical establishment and from the people we turn to help us get through this kind of thing, the yoga practitioners, the doulas and whatever, to kind of embrace the pain and
Ugh.
see the pain as a, I mean, there was, I think I can't remember if I actually mentioned his name in the book, but I know there was one very, very senior midwife that wrote about the pain is what actually makes you a mother. Without having the pain, you're not a mother, which of course is
What?
total bullshit. Because
Yeah.
otherwise,
Oh my
what about people who
God.
adopt? What about people? So, but I think we're caught in this kind of dilemma of saying, well, pain is necessary. Pain is something that you have to undergo, but therefore you shouldn't vocalize your fear of it, because that somehow again makes you a less good mother, makes your somehow is related to your strength of personhood and strength of whatever love that you might feel. So I remember when I was pregnant being very, very afraid of the pain of labor and of the episiotomy specifically, and absolutely horrified. And I couldn't find anything about it anywhere that simply said it is okay to be afraid. It is okay to vocalize your fear and therefore advocate for yourself and get the best treatment. And I couldn't find that written down anywhere. Everywhere I looked, as it were, said, well, when you hold your baby in your arms, it will all be worth it. And I really struggled. And I still struggle with that, because I thought, well, okay, at what point is it not worth it? What game
Yeah.
are we playing here? Is it, if I were to die, would that not be worth it? Okay, well, even then, you're swapping a life for a life. Well, okay, if we were both to die, presumably at that point it wouldn't be worth it. But what kind of sacrificial altar have I made for myself here, simply by wanting to have a child? So I struggled with it a lot, and I think societally we struggle with it, and I don't think there are easy answers, but the one thing I do think is that it is something we need to speak about. It is something we need to be able to talk about more openly.
Yeah, I 100% agree because it is scary. It's just like, especially when, so many mothers go through postpartum depression and there is just so much stigma around like not being happy,
Mm.
just in that moment. It's like completely normal. And so it's really scary. And the first thing I thought about was there's a line you wrote, which is, I think, maternity leave is the life you leave behind. And I was like, how do you think paternity leave is the same or different?
Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, in absolute terms, I suppose I was always very aware that paternity leave in the UK right now, so where are we? We're in 2023. Paternity, the cases of people taking any decent chunk of time, even with shared parental leave, which is becoming more widespread. When I had my children, um, it was so rare, and this is relatively
Mhm.
recent. My son is going to be 5 soon. That the HR company that my husband worked for, the HR department of the company my husband worked for, literally hadn't done it before. So we had to find a
Wow.
friend who was an employment lawyer to sort of walk us through it, and we're very lucky that we had someone who could walk us through it. But even now, when I think it's that much more widespread, people take a few months at most. But I always felt that the difference between me and my husband was that he was dipping into the world of
Mm.
full-time childcare, whereas it was a world I felt as though I'd walked through a hall of mirrors. I couldn't find my way back again to the kind of adult life that I used to lead. I felt, it was as though there was a siren going off in my head. It was always sort of being pulled backwards towards being needed, and whether I was breastfeeding for my first child, and I wasn't for my second, but I felt as though there was that kind of invisible cord. And I don't know that men have that as much for the physical reasons of breastfeeding, but actually our breastfeeding figures in the UK are relatively low. So it's not just that. It is a societal expectation of the absolute selflessness that
Mm.
women must exhibit that I don't think is there for men. I simply, I think there's this, you hear enough about men doing babysitting when it's looking after their own baby, whereas a
Yeah.
woman would never be told that she's babysitting her own baby. Um, I remember very vividly, and I think this is something that I write about quite early on after I'd had my daughter. My cousin was getting married, and my daughter was very small, and so we couldn't have her in the ceremony. So my husband stood outside the function room and held our daughter while I nipped in to watch this wedding. And
Hmm.
a member of staff at the hotel went, "Wow, what a great dad." And I thought, you're being congratulated for holding your baby. That is the level at which, a man is congratulated for performing fatherhood. And, and then I think about all the times that I was, shouted at on the bus or criticized in Marks and Spencer's or whatever because the baby was crying or the baby needed this or the baby needed that. And I just think it's a different world. I feel as though I stepped when I was on the line I think I say in the book is, imagine if we didn't leave on maternity leave, imagine if instead of leaving we stayed. And I
Hmm.
felt as though I had been shut out from my former life and my former existence at the point where I had a baby. It was a very, very hard
Yeah,
year for me.
Marion, honestly, I told my partner this just recently. I said, if I ever have a child, I know for a fact that is the end of my career. I just
Well, I
sort of
don't
like,
think it has to be the end of your career. And indeed, for whatever reason, now this is my career. I never intended to write about this, and the fact that I did was a sort of I'm very pleased and proud that I did.
hmm,
And I won't pretend it's not a struggle. I don't believe it has to be the end, but I do believe that it makes you it absolutely sort of forces you to consider with great clarity what is important, because there is, and I think this is to the huge detriment of women's mental health, but there is very little casual time after you
hmm.
have a baby. I used to fantasize about, what would I do if I had a day? What would I do if I had an hour to just
Oh
watch some
God.
rubbish on the television? Because a friend of mine now sort of terms it quite well. She talks about leisure anxiety. That if you do get an afternoon, you're sort of agonizing over what to do with this precious, precious time. So I don't think it is necessarily the end of anything, but I think it is probably the end of doing things without great thought. I don't think I do anything thoughtlessly anymore, which professionally is probably been good. It makes me really, really reconsider where I put my energy, and maybe even in terms of leisure, probably good. I probably, if I do watch some crap on the television, it's crap I really want to watch. It's very studied crap. But but yeah, I think life loses a certain casualness, and that's
Yeah,
that's all sorts of things, but it is different. I think
it
it's worth
is.
naming that it's different.
Yeah, and you know what? There's just so much judgment, isn't it, about parenthood? And like, in terms of like, just even recently, obviously, there was the pandemic for one,
Hmm.
it basically forced so many mothers to have to stay at home and take care of their kids instead of fathers doing that. And then also, just recently, I think just the other day, there was a Chelsea Handler, the very famous American comedian, being just ridiculously criticized by the likes of Fox News and Tucker Carlson about her decision to not have children. And it was just ridiculous. It was just the most ridiculous things that they said. And so I was just like, I'm like, why is there just so much judgment? It is just like unbelievable. Is
It,
what do you think is
it
the root cause behind this crazy like you must be this?
I I think it's something I think about a lot. My suspicion is that, so the pill was invented in, what became widespread in the 60s, the 70s. So until then, we have to bear in mind that you could use a condom, but the chances were, if you had, there was a reasonable chance if you had penetrative sex, you were going to have a baby.
Hmm.
And the pill, in terms of human history, is a very, very recent thing. And then when it first came out, it was very hard to get hold of. You could have it if you were. So there's, and I suspect that on some deep societal level, or societal levels, because society is not one thing, we have not worked out what women should be.
Hmm.
I think
Wow.
women, that's the only place I can come down to, is that we still, and I think by a we I mean women as well as men, but of
Hmm.
course women exist through the lens of the patriarchy and how we've been brought up through the patriarchy and under the patriarchy. And so, well, God, this is very ingrained and it's very difficult to unpick. But I don't think we know whether women are a sort of slightly different version of a man, whether women are on some level essentially mothers and anyone who doesn't has deviated from some kind of biological path.
Oh God.
I know, but I honestly, because I think saying women are essentially men, but not quite, but sort of, yes, it doesn't, I don't think that accounts, therefore, for the tremendous fascination with women and what they do with their reproductive parts and what they do with their lives and their paths that we endlessly see. And of course, age is in there as well. There's a sense of
Mm.
being up against time and the sense of women and our looks as currency in society.
Yeah.
It's all bound up together, and it feels. I will be fascinated to see where we are 50 years down the line. I won't know where we are 100 years down the line. Probably won't know where we are 50 years down the line. But I would be surprised if we were still here, because we're still very close to when there was a seismic change in what it meant to be a woman. And I think it's easy to forget that sometimes, and then to wonder why it's so incredibly hard
Yeah.
to exist within the society that is around us. And it is hard. It is very, very, very hard. And I say this as somebody who is, Jewish white middle class living in London, a world leading city at a time of, for all society's problems, of great national and global prosperity. And it is still very, very, very hard.
Yeah. 100%. And you mentioned this just now about age, exactly. And after a certain age, there's so many terms to say, over the hill, or especially after perimenopause, after menopause. And so, like, obviously, do we have the right language, first of all, to describe the problems of motherhood, and how do we change this? Because I think we fundamentally don't have the vocabulary.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And I think part of the reason that the book exists was I had my daughter, she'll be 9 this year, and in the days, weeks, and months after she was born, I remember trying to articulate to people what was happening to me, sort of internally what was happening, and I couldn't do it within the bounds of acceptable conversation. And when I tried, people would get up and walk away. People would tell me that I was wrong. People would
Mm.
say, I mean, you must feel so happy. This must be the best day of your life. I mustn't, it's not up to you what I must do.
Mm.
I remembered thinking very keenly. But therefore, I stopped talking. And I
Mm.
didn't really say anything for years and years and years. And I let people tell me what they thought was
Right.
going on inside, people who didn't know. And the other thing I would say is that people who were very, very close to me, my husband, I didn't have the words to articulate to him. And I discovered that I suppose that somebody who is right at your side, if they've not actually produced a human and gone through and then been alone with that baby, it is very difficult to articulate your experience. I think there's, again, and it's not a book hugely about maternity leave, so I'm aware we've come back to it, but I remember trying to articulate the experience of maternity leave to him, and I couldn't really do it. She didn't sleep, the baby didn't sleep, but then she did, and then someone gave me a funny look on the bus, and then it was 4 o'clock, and then I had to, and I was aware it sounded incredibly, incredibly trivial, and I wanted to go, but there seemed no language to say I was trying to keep this new human being alive on my own with zero
Mm.
experience in a world that was absolutely indifferent to the both of us. And I remember he would then, start telling me about his working day, and I would think, no, no, that's not the set. They don't carry the
It's not
same
the
weight,
same.
our days.
Mm.
And so I suppose, so then after I had my little boy, I wrote that first essay which was called 2 weeks, and it appears quite early on in the book. And it was the first time I'd actually been able to say how I was really feeling. I really wanted to try. I couldn't do it in conversation, but I could capture it in words, partly, I think, because I could just keep talking. No one would kind of cut in, and because I think it's a very human thing to go, but it's all right, really. Look at your lovely baby. Oh, aren't you lucky? And actually, no one could do that if I was writing it down. And so I
Yeah.
wrote that essay and put it online, partly just as a way to tell people how I was doing. I mean, it really was as simple as that. And so when I had a very big response to it, I was very surprised, because that
Mm.
hadn't been what I was gunning for. It hadn't been what I was expecting.
I'm glad, you did write it because exactly, obviously, so it is a shared experience and no one can articulate it, and you were able to, which was so important. And,
I mean, I don't think I
and
articulated it perfectly, but I certainly made a better job of it than I had managed in conversation. And I suppose, therefore, the book as a kind of wider project is an attempt to find language for the things that we can't talk about. And something that I've noticed very strongly in reader responses, because I do get messages from readers, is that people often say, you've put together the things I was thinking but hadn't quite managed to say. And
hmm,
actually, more than anything, those responses are really gratifying to me, because I thought I have been thinking a lot about the language that we lack. So
yeah,
it is hard when people are saying, I find these things that you found difficult, or these joyful things, because there's a lot of joy in the book as well. And that's hard to
yes.
talk about. That's very hard to say in conversation, I think. But it is very gratifying to hear that it has resonated in that way. And I hope that we find more language going forward. I really do.
Yeah, me too, because it is so important. And I wanted to ask this because this is also part of the lack of language, which is why is women's pain belittled?
Mm,
Just generally, it is so shocking. Like, obviously, we've seen the stats when you go to a hospital, how
yeah.
women are treated by even obstetricians, GPs, doctors, and things like that. So why do you think, especially in a situation where you are having a child, your pain is belittled?
Yeah. And I want to say misogyny. I
Hmm.
don't know that it's that simple. I think that anything that affects any kind of subset of humanity, and women, for the purposes of this conversation, to be female is a subset of that, um, I suppose is therefore less likely to receive universal interest. I think there is an ick factor when it comes
Mm.
to women's parts. I think
Yeah.
it is unmentionable in polite society still to say,
Yeah.
I have terrible period pain today and I'm bleeding everywhere. So I am going to sit this meeting out. I will come back in an hour and hopefully my flow will have lessened and the cramps will have stopped. You can't say that.
No.
And you should be able to say
Uh,
it. You should
yeah.
absolutely be able to. And you can't. It is, and that's what's behind, our endometriosis detection rates are appalling in this country. I think on
Appalling.
average it takes
Yeah.
7 years from
Yeah.
is it first seeking medical help to diagnosis? It's something
Yeah.
appalling like that. I haven't got stats in front of me, but 7 years to receive a diagnosis. I- It's a mess. It's absolutely a mess. And the problem, I think, as well, is that every time we're highly attuned, we're social creatures. I think women are socialized to be aware of what people are thinking of us. So if I remember coming home after the birth of my daughter, and I'd had forceps. It was a fairly vicious forceps, getting her out. I was all stitched up. I couldn't bend down.
Oof.
And I couldn't say to people, I am in terrible pain because my my perineum has been stitched up and it is bleeding and it is sore and I am frightened. I had no language for that. And the very few times I tried, again, people, you could sort of see the taboo of it on their faces, and you learn very quickly to be quiet. So there's an element, I think, of self censorship, understandable self
Hmm.
censorship, when we talk about women's pain. And it becomes a thing that women speak towards each other, that you talk about in hushed tones that you find in a Facebook group rather than across the dinner table. I would love for my daughter to grow up and be able to say, actually, I can't have dinner tonight. I've got terrible period pains, to all of us, not just to me. I hope that she will be able
Hopefully,
to, but I don't
well,
know.
yeah, 50 years time.
Yeah,
50 years time.
yeah.
Let's hope that is the case. And before, we head to the last question. I just wanted to, yeah, this
Mm.
is the last question because I don't want to take too
That's all
much
right. That's
more
okay.
of your
Don't
time.
worry. Don't worry.
I really appreciate it, but
There are no easy
yeah,
answers.
no, there is, and actually, with the way you explained that, it just felt like the Matrix or something.
Yeah.
You take the red pill and that's it. You're
Well,
out.
and it's terrifying because, yeah, and I think the thing that I suppose that kind of tore at my heart very early on is you have this child, and certainly in particular my first daughter, my first child, who's exclusively breastfed, and she had to be, she was allergic to dairy, so she wouldn't take a bottle, and this knowledge that I was her mother. She didn't have another one. There was no backup. There were no spares. There was no one going to kind of wheel out the cupboard at the point where I kind of crashed and burned. That's it. She looks at you and you go, oh, yeah, how I feel about my mum, that's someone else is feeling that about me, and that is huge. And I also, I haven't ever quite recovered from that. I'm not sure it's something you should recover from, but it is a very, you sort of think about you wanting a baby, but you don't think in return, and at least I certainly didn't until it swung the other way. Well, also now I am the mother. I'm not just me anymore. So yeah, swallowing the
No,
red pill.
yeah. Oh God. Well, it on that happy note.
Well,
No,
it is
but
a happy note. It is very joyful
it
as
is a
well.
happy
It is.
note.
It's hard, but
Yeah,
I think joyful things can be hard. Joy shouldn't always come too easily, and
I think
the
so.
joy is very deep when it comes, and the love is boundless.
Indeed, I think humans kind of reside in binaries a lot
Yeah,
in terms of sort of emotion. So it makes total sense that there is just so much hardship as well
just so
with
much of
this, but
everything. I think so
with
much of everything.
everything.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that we need to have that conversation about the hard parts as well. And
yeah.
so, Marion, thank you so much for
Thank
sharing
you.
this book with the world where everyone does need to hear the hard parts. So, thank you.
Thank you so much.